Where did they come from? How come they were radicalized? Who radicalized them? Which is ironic, right? In the 80s, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and we wanted the Islamic world to declare a jihad against the Soviet occupation, we encouraged jihad in Afghanistan. And then those jihadists went back to their own countries. You know, in Egypt, they had an election in 2012 after the collapse of the Mubarak regime. That was the first fair and free election in the 5,000-year history of Egypt.
In a world shaped by conflict, ideology, and the relentless churn of global change, few voices have navigated the shadows with as much clarity and courage as today's guest. He is a scholar who has walked the halls of academia and the corridors of power, a former senior intelligence service officer whose analysis helped guide U.S. national security at pivotal moments, a leading authority on political Islam, Middle Eastern statecraft, and the forces that shape our modern world. From directing the CIA's Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program to advertising government leaders on terrorism, radicalization, and the shifting tides of the Arab world, to publishing landmark works that challenge assumptions and illuminate the complexities of the Muslim world, Dr. Emile Nakhleh has spent a lifetime decoding the forces that move nations. He was the first American senior Fulbright scholar in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. He has earned the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal and the Director's Medal, and today he continues his mission at the University of New Mexico as a research professor. This is a conversation with a man who has seen the world not just as it is, but as it has become. So settle in, because the Global Pact podcast is about to go deeper into the heart of global security, political transformation, and the human stories behind them. But before we get started with the podcast, we'd like to say a special thank you to everybody who's subscribed to us on YouTube, on Spotify, and follows our Facebook page and Instagram at Lobopac Podcast. If you'd like to follow along and see what we got next on the podcast, please either subscribe to us, follow us. If you have any comments for us, please share them. We always read through all of our comments. But thank you again, and here's the podcast. Growing up in Nazareth, like what drew you to go and study political science?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And as I reflect on it, you know, the first question is why come to this country? You know, we're back in 8th grade, believe it or not, that was like decades ago. When I was in 8th grade, I had a class in geography, and they would focus on countries and products. And I always heard in that class that this United States of America has the most production in cars or in wheat, agriculture, innovation. And I asked the teacher, I said, what is this country? How come this country has all these things? Well, he said, it's a great country, it's a big country, climate and science. And I said, you know, one of these days, that was in my 8th grade. One of these days, I want to go there. So after high school, I went to high school in Nazareth. It's a Catholic Franciscan high school. And after high school, I began to write to American colleges and universities asking for scholarships. I couldn't afford to come here. And in fact, when I landed in this country, in New York, I only had $100 in my pocket. That's all. No money from anybody else. But then I got this free ride, room, board, tuition from St. John's University in Minnesota. It's really a great liberal arts college in the country. It's one very highly recognized, is a Benedictine school, also a Catholic university. I don't know whether you've been to Minnesota or to St. John's, but St. John's is like 80 miles. It's near St. Cloud, Minnesota. It's 80 miles northwest of the Twin Cities. And here I came from Galilee. I did not have even an overcoat. I mean, that first winter, I froze my head off at St. John's. And that's how I started my education in liberal arts, in philosophy, political theory. And that's when I thought, well, studying how people develop government, and then how government develops, and how governments interact internationally, that really captured my imagination.
because you've doing this studies in government, was it to look back at the government over where you were from and diagnose it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, focus on at St. John's. I studied philosophy, Greek philosophy, Roman law, European thought, and that's when most of the theories of our own government here developed. I mean, if you look at or read what the founding fathers wrote about, they oftentimes referred to Greek philosophers. Aristotle, Plato, and so on. And one required book I had in college I had to read was de Tocqueville's book called Democracy in America. He wrote that book back in the 1850s. And he was a French person, came here and toured this country and wrote this classic book and about the idea of this country. And there was another historian here, political historian in the 50s, wrote a book called The Idea of America, and that captured my imagination. And so I began to study then government and the theories, the ideas of government, and why is this country probably not this last year or so, we did not have, but the ideas of government, the theory that the individual counts, that the ruler or the president or the prime minister is not a monarch, is not a king, and that the governing authority gets its right to govern from the people through election. So that really captured my imagination because I came from an area, a region that really did not have any of that, whether because of religion or because of whatever, or poverty or lack of resources, whatever the reason, I just was enamored, I was captured by the ideas that made this country what it is. So I focused then on government, and therefore, remember that was during the Cold War also, of how our relations with other countries. And so that also, created an interest in my mind as to how do we do international relations. So I read another classic book by Hans J. Morgenthau, and I taught both of those books in my classes, called The Politics Among Nations. And that was a classic book in international relations. So I directed then my attention toward political science, political theory, and international relations. And that has been my career all along, except I focused on Islam as another religion of how that religion interacts with politics. So I began to study Islam, and I read the Quran and studied Arabic and to read the Quran. And then I developed that expertise, and that's why the agency then brought me in to uh, develop its expertise on Islam, political Islam.
Very interesting. To sort of circle back on a few of the thoughts there, what do you think about institution building from Roman law or Greek
Yeah,
philosophy and things like that? It seems like I've heard it from a few different people out there saying that one of the reasons why democracy works in this country or in certain countries is because institutions like the is
yeah,
able to function.
yeah. That's a very important point, and that is one of the points that captured my imagination. The rule of law. That in this country, for example, we establish this separation of powers, the three institutions, checks and balances. Of course, sometimes they go out of whack, they go out of balance, but then ultimately, in this country, I've always believed it always comes back to the middle. That despite the extremes, whether it's the civil war, whether it's radical right, radical left, in the end, the average person moves the country back to the middle. But the rule of law is very critical. The role of the judiciary is very critical. In many other countries, there is no separation of power. So when you have the leader or the president or the military commander or whatever form of government they have, that leader is really controlling all other institutions in society. I mean, I've been to almost every Muslim country in the world other than Iran, because when I was in the government, we could not go to Iran. We still can, but I visited and I spent years traveling when I was at the agency in so many Muslim countries. And that is always a common characteristic that you find among so many of those countries. Institutions are not independent. The rule of law is not pervasive. The role of the judiciary is questionable. The executive branch controls probably, I would say, 90% of power in that country. The military is not professional in many of those countries. And that's very interesting point. I'll come to that later if you have a question of how the military in so many of those countries tends to be an extension of the leader and very limited professionalism. And you know what is very interesting? That in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, we brought in so many visiting officers from allied countries and others to spend a year or two in our military academies. And I used, before I went to the agency as a professor, I used to go and lecture in those military academies. The Army War College in Carlisle, the Air Force up in Dayton, Ohio, the Command College up in Leavenworth, the National Defense University in Washington. I lectured in those universities regularly. I lectured to what we call visiting allied officers. And they would come in here, and you know, one of the things they learned here, not necessarily how to wage wars, but the professionalism of the soldier. And that professionalism they take back with them to their countries. And we have seen a difference in that in several of those countries. So institution building, and that's one of my fields in political science, leadership and institution building. And so you build institutions not to be subservient to the ruler, but to be independent and freestanding institutions to manage the country. So this is a long answer to your question about institutions.
What sort of tipped your interest into, like you said, learning or reading the Quran and delving into Islam? Because from what it sounds like, you had a Catholic upbringing.
I was raised as a Catholic, and I'm still a nominal Catholic. I had a brother who was a priest and a sister who was a nun in the family. But, you know, I thought here, when I was in college, I studied really Western political thought, right? But then at the same time, I studied these religious wars in Europe that lasted for centuries and killed millions of people in the name of religion. I mean, you know, whether it's a Protestant versus Catholic, the bishop versus the king. I mean, so it's religious wars. And the last religious war was the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War. And it wasn't really until 48, the Peace of Westphalia, that independent states began to rise. And the role of religion became kind of, you know, subservient in a sense to the state, and a separation of church and state, which is a major thing in our own constitution, right? Well, in Islam, I discovered there was no separation between church and state. So then I wanted to study, you know, we are not talking now about, when we talk about Islam, we are not talking about like 300,000 people, you know, in the southern part of Utah. We are talking about 1.8 billion people. And today, you know, when I started, it was like about 1.6 billion. Now, the latest statistics I saw last year was nearly 1.8 billion. So I said, if there are 1.8 billion and they are all over the world, not just in Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, but they are in Muslim minority countries as well. I mean, they are in Cairo, Egypt, and in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You find Muslims. They are literally you find Muslims today in every Western country, from Australia to European countries to Canada to the United States, Latin America, and in addition to African countries, Muslim countries. So I thought, well, we need to understand more about Islam. We really don't. And there were 15 Muslim hijackers that did 9/11, that attacked this country the first time ever we were attacked like that. I was then already at the agency. And sorry, when I say the agency, I mean,
No, right. You don't have to spell it out, sir. I understand.
yeah. So, but I said, where do they come from? I mean, are these 1.8 billion people? If these are, let's say, 1% or half a percentage point, that's still a lot of people, right? If they are half a percentage point or 1%, are radicals or terrorists or jihadists, what about the other 99%? And I discovered that our own government, we did not have that expertise. And so, to the agency's credit, they brought me in. By the time I went to the agency, I did not start my career there. I mean, by then I was already a full professor, a department chair, tenured professor, excuse me, and I held a chair. So at Mount St. Mary's, where I taught all my teaching career mostly, was at, I don't know whether you know where Mount St. Mary's University is in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. And so when I was brought in, at a senior level. The joke was, I went to HR. I said, "What is this GS business?" She said, "Well, GS1, GS2." I said, "How high does it go?" She said, "GS15." I said, "I take that." So I started GS15, and then she said, "There are also scales like 15.1, 15.2, 15." I said, "How high does it go?" She said, 15.10. So I said, "I take that." So I started at the agency at 15.10, and then I was, of course, promoted to the senior ranks after that. And when I left after a few years, I left as SIS3 or SES3 equivalent. But the point is, they brought me in to establish expertise at the agency on behalf of the U.S. government. And so I established an institute there, an office, and called PISAP, Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program. And so I directed that, and I reported directly to the director of the agency. And it was basically to look at, at the Muslim world for us to understand it. Why did these terrorists come from? Where did they come from? How come they were radicalized? Who radicalized them? How did it start? How did this, excuse me, but you know what, which is ironic, right? In the 80s, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and we wanted the Islamic world to declare a jihad against the Soviet occupation, we encouraged jihad in Afghanistan. And then when the Soviets left Afghanistan, were kicked out, and with our help and Muslim world help, then some of those jihadists went back to their own countries and continued their radical activity. And so the director wanted me to establish this expertise on behalf of the US government to educate our own government about what's happening in the Islamic world. And, we discovered that there's no one monolithic Muslim world. The Muslims of Indonesia are not the same as the Muslims of Egypt or Muslims of Albuquerque. So we had to study that.
You brought up during the Soviet era that the encouraging the Mujahideen and other forces to go against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Is Islam, by what you've seen, good or had tenets, or is it just a money thing where they were possibly being paid as insurgents to go and fight? Because from a religious standpoint, I guess, could you see the same thing happening with Catholics or Christians or things like that? Radicalization.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. In the 1980s, the University of Chicago published a 4-volume a huge study of scholars from the three religions: Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, and Muslim scholars. They contributed to that. And the project was funded by, I don't know, the Ford Foundation, I don't remember now, but it was called fundamentalism. Where did these religions develop fundamentalism? And so you have fundamentalism in Islam, you have fundamentalism in Judaism. I mean, today, radical extremist Jewish settlers in the West Bank, in Israel, are not much different from Islamic extremists. And you have Christian extremists. And so these fundamentalists and the whole project on fundamentalism discovered that no religion of these, what we call the Abrahamic religions, the three religions, is immune to fundamentalism and radical thought. It depends then what factors contribute to that and enhance that, and what factors mitigate against it. And that's what, when I started studying Islam actually in graduate school, and I began to then focus on what is Islam and how does it contribute to jihad, if you will. Not just personal jihad to become better Muslim, but radical violent jihad. That was the question. And that's how we understood, when I went to the agency, understood bin Laden and understood Al Qaeda and understood ISIS later on, right? And so this might be a bit in the weeds, but it's important to make about Islam. You know, in Islam, there are four schools in Sunni Islam. There are four schools of jurisprudence, what we call jurisprudence, and they are the heart of Islamic doctrine. And three of those tend to be mainstream, moderate, do not advocate jihad except personal jihad. The fourth is the radical, narrower, intolerant school, which became known as the Wahhabi Salafi in Saudi Arabia. It is that school that produced violent jihadists. It is that school that produced bin Laden and Al Qaeda. So we began then to understand the difference, and we later on engaged the Saudis about that, and they began to realize. In the beginning, they did not want to listen to us, but once Al Qaeda attacked Saudi Arabia in 2002, then the Saudis reached out to us and say, "Okay, we have now. We just had our 9/11." You know, they said the attack on Riyadh was like the attack on New York. Well, wasn't the same, but they began to view it as their 9/11 and began to understand that they need to deal with their own terrorists that come from their own country. You know, 15 of the hijackers not only were Muslims, but were Saudis. I mean, 15 of the 19 were Saudis. That was not an accident. And some Saudis here provided help and support for these hijackers when they came to this country. So that is an issue. And I think that, the president and the vice president during my stay at the agency really, truly appreciated the work that the agency was doing in the area of Islam.
More on that topic, talking about Islam spreading. Stephen Carr's book on ghost wars talk about, because of the Soviets' ideas of radical change in their communist point of view, that was rubbed on different tenets of Islam. What is your idea on that?
Well, that's true. You know, the Soviets have, and even the Russians during the Tsarist Russia, where before the Soviets came into power, they fought radical Muslims, but at the time they were nationalist Muslims in Chechnya and Georgia and the Caucasus states. Those, after Lenin came to power after the Bolshevik Revolution, they did not want to be under their control. So they had these wars in the Caucasus even way before Afghanistan. I think the Afghanistan was their downfall because the Caucasus, we did not pay much attention to them because the Russians were fighting them there. But once the Soviets projected their power, military power, outside the confines of the Soviet Empire, their war in Afghanistan was the first time they deployed their forces outside the boundaries of the Soviet Union. And of course, it was a disaster for them because they were not trained to fight insurgents. They were not trained to fight just people for their own country, whether they were radical or not. And then Afghanistan began to attract all these Islamic jihadists from all over the Muslim world to fight the Soviet Union. I hate to say it, we encouraged them at that time to do that, you see, because our goal was to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, using both Afghanistan and whatever other fighters, but with our military power, really, and our weapons. But that, when you turn the faucet on, it's not like a faucet you turn it off, on and off. Once you show jihadists that they can do their work through jihad, you cannot turn the faucet off. Those people who came from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Egypt, from Saudi, from the UAE, from Kuwait, from Yemen, well, they went back to their countries, and from Balochistan, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, and from China, the Uyghurs, when they went back to their countries, they did not forget their jihad. They said, we fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Now it's time to fight against their own autocratic regimes. And unfortunately, but correctly, in most of those countries, there was no democracy. So it's not like they could go and say, okay, let's vote. Let's go to the elections and let's see if we can win. There were no elections. There was no democracy. So there was really dictatorship, autocracy. I mean, if you look at any one of those countries I counted, where jihadists went back to, any country you think of, there was no democracy in there, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Morocco or Egypt or Tunisia or Syria or whatever country you think of. There was no democracy. China certainly does not have democracy. And so when they went back and they said, well, it's time then to carry the fight against our own autocratic dictatorial regimes. And that's how that continued, you see. Even in Saudi Arabia, these were Saudis who were fighting against their own monarchy because it wasn't, especially the young people, did not have an avenue, a legal political avenue to express their anger through the ballot box. If the ballot box was not available, they used the bullet. That's it. So
That's really interesting. I mean,
know-
obviously, do you see it? I mean, that just countries under dictatorships need a framework where something such as democracy would be good for them? Or do you think that for most of these autocracies, they won't ever change just because most people have a culture of just fighting in the way they fight? There's no culture of going to the ballot box.
I always say Islam is not inimical to democracy. Islamic dictators are. The rulers don't want democracy. In Egypt, they had an election in 2012 after the collapse of the Mubarak regime. And, that was the first fair and free election in the 5,000-year history of Egypt. Since Ramses II, that was the first election that was free. There were no elections. But people, every time we used to ask, public opinion, one time when I was briefing the president and he asked me, why do they hate us? I said, you know what, Mr. President, they really don't hate us. They hate our policies. And I said, the reason I say this is because we have been conducting public opinion polls, both, overt and covert in these countries. And the views we got from those polls, we used to conduct, even the Pew poll and the Gallup poll used to conduct these polls for 22 Muslim countries, and we oftentimes piggyback on them. And I said, we ask questions. Majorities of those interviewed in those Muslim countries supported free elections, supported participation in policy, supported freedom of expression, supported freedom of travel, supported freedom of opinion. And so I said, these are the views that make our country what it is. And I said, so if those publics, based on public opinion poll, not on our view, our thinking, here, public opinion polls conducted by respected public opinion agency, the Gallup poll, the Pew poll, the BBC poll, the University of Maryland poll. And my analysts and I in that office I created used to focus on those polls. And I said, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, it's not the Islamic world or the average Muslim. Because I said, the average Muslim, I said, I'm not Muslim, but I studied Islam. But I said, the average Muslim is like the average Christian, the average Jewish, the average whatever, wants to pay bills, live, educate their kids, and put food on the table. The average Muslim does not care about politics. Like we, average Christian, we don't care about politics, really. I mean, once we vote, that's it. The leaders do that. They govern. But I said, we care about it when the grocery prices begin to go up, when gas begin to go up, when there are disasters in the country. That's when we care about it. I said, well, that's the same with the average Muslim based on these public opinion polls. Because we asked, name your the top first 5 concerns. And, the first one across the Muslim world was educating my kids, paying my bills, and putting food on the table. And I said, well, this is not different from us. That's what I work and I save and try to have decent income to put my kids through school. And that's our goal. And, I said, I came here on a scholarship because I had no money to go to school. And I had to work a few years after I graduated from high school in order to support the family and wait to hear from American colleges and universities. I mean, growing up as a kid in the hills of Galilee, not in my wildest dream did I ever imagine that I could one day be walking the halls of CIA. Take the Middle East today. I mean, the Middle East today has nearly 500 million people, from Turkey to Iran, let's say, including all the Middle East, Near East, Greater Middle East. And they need to produce, according to the World Bank, 60 million jobs a year to meet demand. And there is no way on God's green earth they can produce that. There isn't. And one economist, a friend of mine, he's an international economist, he said 25% today, this year, of 25% of all kids born this year in the greater Middle East will never, ever have a job if they stay in that region. 25%.
That is really interesting. It's interesting you bring that up just because of the different, I would say, how different economies work, right? Because is it in those regions, are they primarily, I imagine they're either commodity based on agriculture or oil. And other than that, it's not like there's a booming tech sector or anything like that.
No, there isn't. The Middle East is there are like two, three, 4 economies. One economy in the oil countries, right? That is, but all of those, it's called what we call in political science as rentier states or rent states. In other words, one single commodity, right? So the oil countries is basically oil and gas. But invariably, those countries, other than Iran, don't have many people. The large populations exist in countries that don't have oil. And so there you have also the gray economy, kind of informal economy. And they oftentimes rely on foreign aid. So like Jordan and Lebanon and they receive a lot of foreign aid from this country. I mean, so poverty is real. It's not like, one time I was asking a young jihadist who was arrested in Afghanistan and he was at Guantanamo. And I said, so how did you start your jihad? What did you do? He said, what did you do jihad in high school? He said, no. I said, what did you do in high school? He said, well, I was looking to go to parties and getting girls' phone numbers and so on. So I said, so when did you start jihad? He said, after high school, he had no job. He stayed at home, had no money. He started going to the mosque next door. And then, you know what? 3 months later, he found himself in Afghanistan. Somebody gave him money. Somebody got him a passport. Somebody got him contact to along the way. And somebody facilitated his travel. And that's how he started doing jihad. He said he didn't think of that in high school. And so the economy is a real factor. The recruiting, radicalizing sheikhs and mullahs and religious leaders are another factor over the years. Their religion is another factor. Not all of their religion, their interpretation of their religion becomes a source of radicalization. That's why you find these people who follow that school of jurisprudence in Saudi Arabia ended up becoming violent jihadists. But you don't find that in Indonesia in the beginning or in many other countries, even in Egypt. You don't find that in Albuquerque. You don't find that in many other Muslim communities. You find one and two, but these are what we call lone wolves. And these days they are radicalized on social media. Unfortunately, they need a radicalizing cleric or mullah. They can get online on the dark web and get radicalized.
How have you seen social media like propel radicalization? Is it just because people shoot these videos?
It used to be cassettes many
Mhm.
years ago, and then it became videos. You know that Awlaki, that jihadist terrorist leader whom we killed during the Obama administration in Yemen. After his death, millions of copies of his sermons are traded throughout the Muslim world. Millions of copies. And so the social media spreads that word. If we did not have social media, you would not have the spread of this type of jihadism on. And so today, if you Google him, Awlaki is his name, Awlaki, you see just millions of his sermons all over the web.
Interesting. Going back to your career, how did you, because you were study or teaching at St. Mary's, how did that process work?
It's very interesting. At Mount St. Mary's, I used to teach, also used to teach on Islam and used to teach on the greater Middle East and the Islamic world and our relations with other countries. And, beginning with American foreign policy, I always used to teach my students that our foreign policy has always been a struggle to balance the big means interest, versus the big V, our values. So we had to deal with these countries. Most of them were not democratic. So we had to kind of nudge them toward the rule of law, but at the same time we had to deal with the rulers who were basically autocrats. And so one time, and every 6 years, and the seventh, I would apply for a Fulbright to go on sabbatical. Because in teaching, every 6 years you can apply for a sabbatical. So I went, excuse me, excuse me, I went 1 year as a Fulbright to Bahrain, and which was really phenomenal experience. And then I began to study the Gulf and wrote several books on the Gulf. And then 1 year I was as a Fulbrighter at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I focused on the Palestinians and doing research in the West Bank and Gaza. And then I wrote a couple of books about that. So 1 year, third sabbatical, I really wanted to, because I had really, please forgive me, I felt I was successful. I had achieved a lot, and I wanted to contribute something to the government. So applied for a sabbatical in Washington. At that time, what they call a scholar in residence, it was at State Department, but State Department, the director of that program told me that they stopped that because of money and because of this and that. But there was a place in Washington that could have that. And so it was the agency. I said, the agency? I was a professor. I said, I never thought I would even work for the agency. So he said, can I give your name to one of the directors at the agency? I said, fine. So they contacted me, and I went down there for 1 year, one academic year, as what they call a scholar in residence. That was my first year at the agency. And then at the end of that academic year, I left and went back to Mount St. Mary's. But I loved my work at the agency. And when I went back, the agency said, well, can I do consulting for them 1 day a week? I said, yeah, okay. So I would go down there 1 day a week. Mount St. Mary's was about 7 miles from the agency. So I would go in the morning early and then drive home in the evening. And but they said, well, really that doesn't work too well. They wanted me to be there full time. So and I said, so what would that entail? So they said these are the three main functions they wanted me to focus on. And so, as I say, the rest is history. And so I went down there, and I had perhaps the most amazing, rewarding career in my life, in my entire. And my wife even volunteered, and she became the chair of the family advisory board for 5 years at the agency to work with spouses of young case officers and others who go overseas. And so they had issues, social issues, decision making issues, the wives, when they were by themselves here. And because many places the spouse could not go with and so we had a just absolutely phenomenal time. And then, I left the agency, and we moved to Albuquerque. And then UNM got hold of me, and then I did that for 10 years at UNM, basically part time, but I was working full time.
And was that through a political science field, basically?
No,
Teaching
no,
the
it was really through the provost,
oh, okay.
because I told the provost we were socializing in somebody's house, and I told the provost, I said, I know nothing about UNM. But from the few conversations I've had the first year or two with faculty members here, friends I got to know, it seems to me, I said, the UNM is situated in such a unique place that no other university in the country has that location. I said, you are situated next to two world-class global labs, as it's Sandia and Los Alamos. And the third, more recently, has grown, which is AFRL, the Air Force Research Lab. I said, it seems to me you have not utilized that proximity as an institution, because individual faculty members, some of them in engineering and sciences, had contacts and consulting agreements and contracts with the labs, but not institutionally. I said, UNM can become what I call a national security institution, because I researched and taught about intelligence and so on, but I said you can really go up to a higher level than a regional university. Well, he said, probably the faculty would not agree with it. I said, I don't know, try it. He said, well, do you want to take a stab at it? I said, I don't have time. I used to do at that time a lot of consulting for the agency. I used to practically commute between here and Washington. I said, I don't really have time, but I can give you 1 day a week. My wife was sitting there, and she started laughing. She said, when did you ever give 1 day a week on any problem? Well, the fact is that I took that on, and I ended up working my head off, really, not 1 day a week, every day of the week. It was a really part time job for 1 day a week, and they paid me for 1 day a week. But we got that, and the faculty was resistant in the beginning. because they thought, well, I came from the agency and they did not like intelligence. And, I said, it's not about you or me, it's about your students. Do you want your students to drive, your graduates to drive Uber, or do you want them to have a decent job, to serve their fellow citizens, to serve the country, to serve the national interests of this great country? And I said, that is my point. I am not here for a job. I said, I retired. I don't need another job. I'm not here to take your jobs away. I really don't care what your ideology is. I said, that's not my concern. But my concern is, do you want to support the creation of an institute that serves your students in the long run? And you know what? In the beginning, there was resistance, but they came around. And so we created GNSPI, the Global and National Security Policy Institute. I think you interviewed the director who replaced me, Phil.
I did.
And so, and it's been doing very, very well. Then we created a master's degree that is online for working professionals. Anybody can take it. For the military, for the labs, most of our students come from the labs, and the FBI, the police, all kinds of government departments. And the fact is, Albuquerque has a very rich national national security environment. And so it's highly successful. When it really took off, and the program has developed real well thanks to Jennifer. I don't know whether you met her, Jennifer Nieto. She is the program manager. She and I really created that program and the degree. And so she continues to run the program on day-to-day basis, really. And I told the provost, I said, I think I'm going to throw in the towel. He said, you can't leave. I said, of course I can leave. I said, look, I'll be happy to continue to help, and I remain on the external board, but I said, it's time, I need to do something else. And so that's how I left. I told the provost, you remind me of the director of the agency. He said, how's that? I said, when I told him I'm leaving, he said, you can't leave. I said, of course I can leave. And so, I think this is, unfortunately, the culture here, please forgive me for saying this, generally is not a national security culture. But I said, look, let's take a broader view of national security, and not just intelligence, not just terrorism, but it's all from the military power to natural resources. I said, all of that covers national security. And I said, the second thing is that what happens in the world globally affects what happens in our country, and what happens in our country affects what happens in New Mexico. I said, our commerce, this state deals exports and imports commerce from many countries. So I said, the labs are here. So of course it is important for national security, but you need to change the culture as much as the institution building.
Talking about institutions, we
Yeah,
sort of like at the beginning of this. Do you think it's more of I mean, obviously most places don't, it's not like the East Coast and Ivy League institutions or institutions like that where people are always going to them to search
yeah,
for national security type of jobs, career fields, things like that. I think by founding the program, what you've done is absolutely amazing because now it is a draw. Although it's
yeah,
sort of, I think it's just continuing to grow.
yeah.
I think another
That's
maybe
a
helpful.
work in progress.
Right. Obviously, yeah. But on top of that, other than out of state, I mean, do you think there's ways of in state, I guess, ways to attract more growth and ideas of service and national security, and why it's
There
important for young people to understand that?
Yep, there is. I actually, before I left, I presented the provost with what I call the sustainability plan. But the sustainability plan basically to grow the program to bring in more students from high school, beginning at high school, right, to college, and to provide them with the means to begin to think in terms of national security. And I said our there are committees here that would reach out to these national security companies in town, and they are willing to help, but they need a push from the university. I mean, honestly, if it went for one person, the program would not have gotten anywhere. It was a one person's effort, but the institution needs to get involved behind it, and that sustainability plan is not really expensive at all. I gave figures. I said it's basically to bring in more students, to bring in high school students, to bring in some of our ROTC students to begin to go to think about expanding into national security programs in the country. I mean, I said it's attracting good number of students, but they are mostly professionals from the labs. I said I want that program to start at the high school level and the college level, because the part that is really successful in GNSPI is the master's degree. I said, that's great, but I said, for already working professionals. But what we need is for undergraduates to be expanded. And I think that is, and between you and me, it's not really money. I think it's partly culture. The culture of national security has to become imbued in the thinking process. And ultimately, we can't escape it. You can't stay living in a cocoon. I mean, you can't say, well, this is New Mexico. We are a South Regional University, Southwestern Regional University. I said, why? This university has tremendous diversity, has great scholars, has one of the most successful ROTC programs in the country and one of the longest in a sense. But I said, why not? Why not mix all of that and begin to work toward that culture? So, I mean, I don't know whether that answers your question, but
It does. Uh, From yeah, it's something we continue to rely on as far as a draw to the university. We have a lot of students from Illinois or other states who are coming here
yeah.
understanding, oh, this is something that's valuable to me that I could go and use, hopefully to get a job in the FBI or something like
Yeah.
that, some intelligence agency later.
And we have sent a number of students to Washington and intelligence agencies.
Mhm.
And the State Department and one recently retired from State Department was one of our students, and he moved to Corrales. He and his wife retired at Corrales after a very distinguished career, and he was a graduate of this program. I mean, the undergraduate before even we established a master's program.
Hmm.
I think the undergraduate to me is much more important for this effort than the graduate program. I mean, that is important for people who are already working, whether at UNM or the FBI or the police force, police department, or wherever. But we need to have resources and the undergraduate and begin to bring high school students. And that was part of my sustainability plan, to bring high school students for the summer, a month in the summer, pay them for it, and introduce them to national security program, broadly defined national security issues. And you see what is unique about our master's program here, unlike any other, because we looked at 10 universities with master's program like that. And this is unique because in most other universities, whether UT Austin or Georgetown, those programs seem to be single issue programs, like terrorism or commerce or international this or that, or intelligence analysis. But this program is based on a more global definition, much wider definition of national security, which means it's interdisciplinary. So we have a professor who teaches from law school, used to teach a course on human rights law and national security. One professor from geography taught about food security, water security, and energy security. And I said, if you look at the infrastructure in this country, the energy infrastructure is pretty, threatened, really subject to all kinds of nasty things. So I said, if we don't have security in these areas, well, we won't have security in other areas. So it's a broad definition of national security. That is what is unique about this program.
Definitely. What so for students going through the program right now, maybe looking for jobs in intelligence as either case officers, analysts, any of the agencies in intelligence or law enforcement, do you have any words of advice for undergraduates and graduates?
Yeah, well, that is a very good point, because when I lectured to undergraduates about this area, they used to ask me. They said, "Okay, Dr. Nakhleh, what courses should I take to qualify for that?" I said, "That's the wrong question." I said, "The right question is, what area do you think you can excel at, and what passion do you have for that area?" I said, "You need two things. You need an area of expertise that you can develop, an area of interest, and then you need to have passion for it." I said, when I was brought to the agency, they did not bring me there because they liked me as a person. They didn't care. I said, they brought me in because of my expertise in these areas, in the greater Middle East and in political Islam. And I said, so for undergraduates, focus on one area, and that even the agency and others, there are, 16, 17 intelligence agencies in the country. It's not just one agency. I mean, every department, whether it's Treasury, DHS, other agencies, they all have intelligence branches in it and intelligence departments. So you don't have to work, the FBI, you don't have to work for one particular agency. NSA, CIA, you can. But, so my point is to these students is that they can hire against dozens of skill sets. It doesn't matter what your set is. They will hire you if you are good at it, if you are hardworking at it, and if you have passion for it.
Definitely. And do you think that on top of understanding a region, the language is just as
Yep.
important?
Very, very important. In fact, that is very critical for analysts and case officers. We always rely on translations, but translation is not the real thing. And a State Department used to have 1 year of Arabic. That was not enough. They raised it to 2 years. That's not enough. Now they raise it to 3 years of Arabic language full time, to be able to understand the nuances of the language, to go beyond ordering at a restaurant or beyond talking to a taxi driver. You need to kind of understand the language that they use. One of my jobs was to write a short piece every time bin Laden spoke. It doesn't matter what message and where he gave it. Wherever it is, I get a call, and that a message has just been given by bin Laden. I would go and I analyze the language, not translation, because our CTC would do the translation. I would just write, what is the importance of this message? What are the few concepts and words he is emphasizing in this message? And when I do this, just one page, no more than one page of that message, I would attach it to the PDB and send it down to be briefed downtown as part of the president's daily brief, the PDB. And that was very important. And the importance of that was the language, the nuance, understand.
Definitely. Well, sir, we super appreciate having you on the podcast and the students who are going to learn from you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be happy to, if you need my help, to stop by in a month or two and talk to your students, but not like at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's too early for me.
Yeah, no problem.